Horror remakes. Just hearing those two words can cause some horror movie fans to lose their shit. Horror remakes are often seen as a lazy and uncreative way to cash in on a horror movie's name recognition or legacy. Most horror movie fans are quite passionate about their horror films, and when talks of remakes come along, it usually brings with it disgust, disappointment, and trepidation. I've had people give me shit on YouTube simply for the few occasions I mentioned a certain film being ripe or worthy of a remake. Remakes in general can often be described as soulless, pointless, unnecessary, and unoriginal, and there are plenty of horror remakes that fall under those adjectives. But are we as horror fans too hard on the remake? I would be lying if I said I don't roll my eyes every time I hear an announcement of remake, or shake my head in disapproval when a horror franchise is being rebooted. When I was younger, I would fear the remake because it meant the continuity of a horror series I loved was dead and obsolete, or that a remake would tarnish the original movie's reputation. But over time, my opinion of the horror remake has changed. Retrospectively, looking back on some of my own favorite horror films has shown me that I shouldn't be so disapproving and callous of remakes. I love 1980s horror movies, and some of my favorite horror movies from that decade just so happen to be remakes. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1988's The Blob, David Cronenberg's The Fly. These are considered modern-day horror classics. Well, maybe not the criminally underrated The Blob, but these films were remakes. I'm of the mindset that a good movie is a good movie, regardless of its origins or novelty. Now, you can say that horror remakes from the 80s and 90s aren't judged the same as modern-day horror remakes, and that would be pretty accurate. This probably has to do with the modern horror fan and our nostalgia for the 70s and 80s, as well as the quality of the remakes coming out post-2000. A lot of the remakes that started coming out in the early to late 2000s were watered-down cash grabs by studios looking to get teens in seats off name recognition alone. Terrible remakes like The Fog and Prom Night. These movies weren't bad because they were PG-13. These movies were bad because they weren't made with respect for the source material, and also because they were just bad. Subpar remakes like The Hitcher and Black Christmas were entertaining enough to be considered okay, but most horror remakes from that time weren't very good, which is where I think a lot of the hate for the modern remake stems from. That shitty period of remakes with movies like April Fool's Day, When a Stranger Calls, and The Wicker Man.
Oh, no, not the beast! Not the beast! Ah! Open my eyes! My eyes! Ah! Ah!
That's not to say there wasn't a few solid and downright classic remakes put out during that decade. It's just that the good remakes were heavily outnumbered by the shitty remakes. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes were both solid, entertaining, and well-respected remakes. They were good movies regardless of their originality because they were made with creativity and delivered what horror fans wanted. Dawn of the Dead was another solid remake. Even the big three 80s horror icons weren't safe from remakes, as we saw the release of the highly enjoyable but underrated Friday the 13th reboot and the polarizing Rob Zombie Halloween remake. As a lifelong Jason and Michael fan, I enjoy both remakes. But I will always hold a special place of hatred in my heart for the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot. That was a terrible, terrible movie and one of my worst theater experiences. That was a soulless production, a poorly acted, poorly scripted remake that did nothing interesting or fun with the premise. But Jackie Earle Haley is cool, so I will say he's fucking cool, and was the best part of that abomination.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you.
That's it! You're locked in here with me!
Who the hell is this? I'm your new nightmare.
Over the last decade, 2010 onwards, it seems the horror remakes have been on average decent. There doesn't seem to be as many downright shitty remakes, and the majority of remakes that got produced were made by directors who respected and loved the original. Which does make a difference. You can tell when you're watching a movie if the people making the movie give a shit or not. The slew of remakes from the 2000s, no one cared. The Fright Night remake, for example, was a fun and entertaining vampire flick that did a good job of modernizing the story and featured a solid cast, many of whom were fans of the original. I still believe The Fright Night is a very enjoyable and underrated remake. Stephen King's It, My Bloody Valentine, Evil Dead, these were remakes that helped make the word remake a little more bearable in the last decade. More recent remakes like Pet Sematary and Child's Play also prove that an interesting remake is better than a soulless one. The Invisible Man was one of the better horror films released last year, and it was another take on the old Invisible Man story. I think producers these days have learned their lesson and are focused on making quality movies instead of cashing in on the name recognition. In conclusion, I do think as horror fans we are a bit too hard on remakes. It's hard not to be critical of remakes, especially if the original is a modern classic or if it holds a nostalgic place in our hearts. And I admit that it is hard not to be pessimistic when you've been burnt plenty of times by shitty or lazy remakes. But I would rather see a horror series I love get resurrected for a reboot instead of rotting away in direct-to-video hell. And what about those horror franchises that haven't had a sequel in decades? I'd rather a remake get made if a sequel is never going to happen. I've learned to be more open to the remake and judge every horror flick on its own merits. Maybe the next time they reboot an 80s horror classic, you'll remember the good remakes and have some hope. Because if a cynical, die-hard 80s horror fan like me can learn to accept the remake, maybe you can too.